suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we're debating a bill that a number of us have spoken on a number of occasions. Since my last address on the Senate floor on this topic, we've received a score regarding the bill from the Congressional Budget Office. Now, remember, it's the CBO's score it's the CBO's role to put together a score on legislation we're considering. It's part of how the system works in Washington so that we can assess what will and will not add to the deficit and how it will do so if it does. It's an important part of the process. When we finally received the CBO score just about 48 hours ago, we discovered a few things. We discovered that despite the representations that we've heard by the bill's staunchest advocates to the effect that the bill would be paid for, that is, that it would not add to the debt and deficit, and that it would not add to the debt and deficit in a way that also didn't involve raising taxes. As it turned out, the CBO rejected the claim that this bill was paid for. In fact, the CBO concluded that 256 of the $550 billion in claimed pay-fors didn't pay, that they're not pay-fors, and thus that they will considerably, I mean, we're talking here about over $250 billion that would go right on to the debt and deficit. They also concluded that in the long run, over the next 10 years, we'll be looking at an additional $340 billion in cost to the federal government, a cost that by some estimates could reach as high as $400 billion because of the spillover effect that this bill is likely to have on future spending, contracting authority and otherwise. So this bill is not paid for. The pay-fors suggested by the bill's proponents don't get the job done. In fact, more than half of them simply don't get there. We do, however, see that there are some of the pay-fors that create significant policy concerns. So one of the pay-fors that isn't fake is an extension of the so-called G fees. G fees being imposed by entities like Fannie Mae that will inevitably increase the cost that home buyers will face when they go to buy a home. Now, why does that matter here? Well, we've seen a startling uptick in inflation across the board, everything from gas to groceries, everything from health care to housing. We see that increasing stunningly in a way that a lot of people are pointing out correctly, that first-time home buyers are now finding it very difficult to get into a home. This is something that's going to end up affecting all poor and middle-class Americans at a time when they can little afford it. And yet we're increasing these fees that are, in effect, a backdoor invisible tax on a lot of those who are at least in a position to pay it. Some of the other non-fake pay-fors that actually do bring something in include an increase in the fees paid by manufacturers and distributors of certain chemicals. The issue there is that this fee, well, labeled as not a tax because technically speaking it's not a tax, will end up increasing the price of basically every consumer good purchased by the American people. The way these things end up working is that, to the tune of about $15 billion or so, Americans will find that pretty much everything they buy, from apparel to electronics, will get a little more expensive. They may not see it. In fact, the overwhelming majority of them won't even know to attribute it to this particular piece of legislation. But it will have that effect. It will make all Americans a little poorer. It'll make all Americans face a very stark reality in which their already strapped dollars that they earn will go just a little bit less far. We have to remember that from one year to the next, we don't see dramatic fluctuations in the quantity of goods that the American people have access to, that they may buy. In other words, the U.S. economy is capable of producing a relatively foreseeable, predictable, somewhat finite supply of goods in a particular year. When that doesn't change dramatically from one year to the next, as it almost never does, but you dramatically increase the money supply in the U.S. economy, then what you see is that everything gets a little bit more expensive. This ends up hurting, in particular, America's poor and middle class. It ends up hurting, in particular, those Americans, including most Americans, who in one way or another live paycheck to paycheck, who in one way or another depend on the income that they have, and the income that they have is relatively fixed. So as a result of that, they don't get as far. Now, you've got some Americans, including the wealthiest and well-connected in our society, who may well figure out ways to get wealthy off of this bill. One way or another, they can play things to their advantage, and they may make a lot of money off of it. You've got another category of very wealthy Americans, maybe, people in the top 1 or 2% of income earners, who might notice that the things they buy are getting more expensive, but it might not affect them all that much. But then you've got everyone else, and I mean the vast, overwhelming majority of all Americans, who, in one way or another, plan out each year knowing that they've got a relatively finite amount of money to spend. And that money goes less far when we just print money to the tune of trillions and trillions of dollars. Remember, the federal government in recent years has been spending about $4 trillion a year. Tragically, even at the top of our economic cycle, with record low unemployment and with record high growth, we were still spending $1 trillion a year more than we were bringing in. Bringing in about 3, spending about 4. This was inexcusable then. It would be inexcusable now, except that we're making it much, much worse. Last year, we took in about $3 trillion, and we spent $3.6 trillion, borrowing and then printing close to $4 trillion additional dollars. What does this do? Well, it makes all Americans just a little bit poorer, especially those living on a relatively fixed income. So this is troubling when we do that. We ought to be concerned when we do that. Inflation numbers that are coming out all the time, including some that I've heard about the first time today, indicate that everything's getting more expensive. And what are we doing? Well, we're on track to spend another $1.2 trillion, including $550 billion of new spending, which the bill's proponents claim is paid for when most of it isn't paid for. And that portion of it that is paid for is, in one way or another, often paid for in a way that will inure to the detriment of poor middle-class Americans. This is concerning. It's also concerning that one of the other pay-for provisions, the one focused on cryptocurrency, focuses on an industry that's rapidly developing within the United States, that depends on a lot of innovation happening in the United States. One of these pay-for provisions seeks to bring in more revenue to the federal government, or at least to promise more revenue to the federal government, with the promise of requiring those who buy and sell cryptocurrency to treat it the same way as they would the exchange of securities. Mr. President, this is very different than securities. These aren't just stocks. It's something very different. It's a medium of exchange that, if adopted more widely, could facilitate a lot of economic activity and a lot of innovation within the United States of America. If, in fact, we pass this bill, mark my words, it's going to have a chilling effect on innovation within this sector. And what you'll see is the flight of innovation and investment related to innovation to offshore locations around the globe. Places outside the United States may well be the ones to reap the benefit associated with the loss here in the United States if we adopt an unproven, untested, unknown strategy for dealing with something, trying to adopt many decades-old regulatory policies to a completely new form of exchange, one that, by the way, values very highly the privacy of those who exchange in it. And so if what you're going to do is take away that value by requiring that all of it be registered and publicly disclosed, and by giving the federal government the ability to peer into it, you're going to stifle innovation. You're going to make a lot of people upset, and you're going to make Americans poorer. At the heart of a lot of this is a concern that the federal government, as it takes more and more money, as it prints more and more money, as it requires Americans to work weeks or months out of every year just to pay their federal taxes, only to be told that it's not nearly enough and hasn't been enough for many decades because we're nearly $30 trillion in debt. It's still not enough because we're still going to borrow and print more. It's insulting to them, and it's especially insulting to them when you tell them that in connection with the same legislation that also includes other intrusions into their privacy. For example, there's a pilot program called for in this legislation that would be created by this legislation that would be designed specifically to monitor how many miles someone drives in a year. Now, this has long been a fantasy of a number of people who would like to see the federal government tracking miles driven by every motorist in America. Now, Mr. President, we all know that there's almost no way to achieve this that wouldn't excessively interfere with the privacy rights of every man, woman, and child in America. Look, the American people are fine with a government that makes sure that we're safe from foreign aggressors, that regulates interstate and foreign commerce, that coins money and regulates the value thereof, that adopts a uniform set of bankruptcy laws, immigration laws, that protects trademarks, copyrights, and patents. What they do not want is a nanny. What they do not want is a snooping device added to every car that will track them, that will track where they and their families are going. It's none of their darn business. Keep the federal government out of this. Look, whether you want more government spending or not, chances are, if you're listening to this, you probably are concerned, regardless of what political hat you wear, regardless of who you voted for in recent presidential or congressional elections. You probably don't want the federal government in your car, monitoring your every move, going where you're going. We know that when governments do that, when they start to assume that everything is government's business, bad things happen. It ends in tears and wars. That's none of the federal government's darn business. We don't want the federal government even developing technology to start snooping on every person's every move. Which brings me to yet another intrusion on personal privacy and liberty in this legislation, Section 24220. Calls for the development and within just a few years, the formalization and finalization of regulations that would require passenger vehicles manufactured and sold within the United States to have a device that would passively measure the blood alcohol content of the driver and do so in a way that would inhibit or at least impair the ability of the vehicle to operate if the vehicle, in its infinite wisdom, was able to ascertain that the blood alcohol content of the driver was over 0.8. Now, look, we're all for stopping drunk driving. It's terrible. It results in countless lives lost. But, Mr. President, we can all see a lot of things that can go wrong with that. Setting aside for a minute the constitutional implications of the intrusiveness of putting technology in every passenger vehicle that requires at the outset, without any finding that anyone has done anything wrong, that requires you to take a test mandated by the federal government every time you want to do something as simple as turn on your car. Then let's consider what happens when, with such a technology, which to my knowledge doesn't yet exist, with such a technology, assuming it's able to come into existence because of these burdensome regulations in a few years, that technology, if they're able to develop it, is going to be costly. Who does that hurt? Well, you guessed it, poor and middle-class America, who will all of a sudden find that every passenger vehicle will become a lot more expensive. It's just the way it works. When we mandate the creation of new federal regulations, and those federal regulations apply to any new automobile sold in the United States, the price of new automobiles goes up. And in the case of a particularly novel, particularly sophisticated technology like this one, I suspect it'll go up a lot. This may not be troubling to the millionaires and billionaires out there who don't feel the pinch of that, but to everyone else, the 99% of all Americans, more than that, I suppose, this hurts. Moreover, what happens when that technology malfunctions? Not if, but when. Look, we've all had cars that will malfunction for one reason or another. And oftentimes it's basic security devices, something as simple as that annoying beeper that goes off until you put your seatbelt on. Sometimes, some people will put their seatbelt on and it still pings. That's a terribly annoying nuisance when that happens. The consequences are much more deeply felt. They're much more severe if someone gets in the car, whether it's to go to work, to come home from work, to take a loved one to the doctor or the hospital, and it doesn't work. Look, glitches happen. And if you're talking about adding an override to a vehicle, maybe that override to the vehicle mistakenly thinks that it smells alcohol. Maybe it doesn't like the aftershave or cologne you're wearing on that particular day. Maybe the whole thing stops working and your car stops working with it. This isn't one of those things where you can just open up the hood and find the presence of an on-off switch, as Jerry Seinfeld might have put it many years ago. No, this is much more sophisticated technology that the average, hardworking American isn't going to be able to fix quickly. They won't even be able to see it. There again, they're going to face more costs as they take their vehicle into the shop to have it evaluated by a certified technician capable of dealing with that brand new, very sophisticated, very expensive technology. So with each of these things, Mr. President, we see something of a common theme. The federal government, which already plays too prominent a role in too many people's lives, which is already taxing us too much, spying on us too much, and considering everything under the sun its business. We're making even more things its business, from cryptocurrency to where and how far you drive your car, to whether you can operate your car at all. We're doing all of this so that we can spend even more federal money on even more federal infrastructure projects, which are even more expensive by virtue of the fact that we're dealing with federal dollars. For the simple reason that compliance with all the federal regulations that accompany the expenditure of federal infrastructure dollars costs a lot of money. In many states like mine, it can cost 20%, 30%, sometimes even more, on top of what it would cost if these were just state revenues that they were spending. So I'd ask the question, is it worth it? I'd ask the question, do we want Big Brother knowing our every move? I'd ask the question, do we want a government that's already requiring you to work weeks or months out of every year just to pay your federal taxes? Do you want it printing even more money, making sure that the dollars that you spend, which are finite, limited, and sacred, will go even less far? I think not, and I urge my colleagues who support this legislation to reconsider.